Tonight, we sail into the smoke and salt of the Atlantic, aboard a British warship on the morning of the Battle of Trafalgar. Our story follows a naval officer, weathered, disciplined, quietly aware this might be his final dawn. He's not on the deck shouting orders or carving glory. He's below, moving between guns, steadying nerves, keeping order as chaos draws near. This isn't a tale of triumph. It's one of tension, the creak of timber, the boom of distant cannons, the cold calm that settles before the storm. If you enjoy these slow, immersive journeys through the quieter moments of history, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps us keep creating these peaceful windows into the past. And here's a question for the comments tonight. If you had to spend just one night aboard a ship in the age of sail, what part of the crew would you want to be? I love reading what you think. Everyone has such different takes. Now, ease into stillness. Let the waves rock gently beneath you, and the wind carry your thoughts out to sea, and join me aboard His Majesty's ship. The morning came grey and still, the way October mornings do of the Spanish coast. I remember waking in my hammock before the boatswain's call, the way you do when something important is waiting for you. The ship was already alive with quiet movement, that particular energy that builds before battle. HMS Belleisle creaked and groaned beneath me, her timbers settling as she rolled gently in the swell. I'd been at sea for 17 years by then, since I was 12 years old, and I knew the sounds of a ship like other men know the sounds of their own houses. Every crack and whisper meant something. That morning she felt different, expectant perhaps, or maybe that was just me reading my own feelings into her oak bones. My uniform was stiff with salt and wear. The blue wool had faded in patches where the sun had caught it strongest, and the gold lace on my cuffs had tarnished to a dull bronze. I'd tried to clean it the night before with vinegar and a bit of cloth, but there's only so much you can do with what you have aboard ship. Still, it was my best coat, the one my mother had helped me choose when I received my commission. The thought of her always made my chest tight in a way that had nothing to do with the sea air. The deck was already busy when I climbed up from below. The men moved with that particular efficiency that comes from months of drilling, each man knowing his place and his task without needing to think about it. They were good men, most of them. Some were press, taken from merchantmen or pulled from the taverns by the press gangs, but they'd settled into naval life, the way water finds its level. Others were volunteers, drawn by the promise of prize money or simply because they had nowhere else to go. I could smell the familiar mixture of tar and rope, gunpowder, and unwashed bodies, the salt tang that gets into everything at sea. There was something else in the air that morning, though. A sharpness, like the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. The men felt it too. They worked quietly, efficiently, but their eyes kept drifting toward the horizon, where we knew the French and Spanish fleets were waiting. Captain Hargood had been on deck since before dawn, his spyglass in hand, studying the distant line of enemy ships. He was a good captain, fair but firm, the sort of man who inspired confidence without needing to raise his voice. I'd served under officers who ruled through fear, and I'd learned that fear makes men hesitate when they most need to act. Hargood never made that mistake. The breakfast was the usual ship's fare, salt pork and hardtack biscuits that you had to tap on the table to shake out the weevils. The ship's cook had made an effort, though. There was coffee, real coffee, not the chicory substitute we sometimes had to make do with. The galley fire gave off a warmth that felt precious in the cool morning air, and I found myself lingering there longer than usual, watching the flames dance behind the iron grating. Some of the younger midshipmen were nervous. I could see it in the way they held themselves, too straight, too careful. I remembered that feeling from my first real action, off Toulon, when I was barely 16. The way your stomach feels hollow and full at the same time. The way every sound seems both too loud and too distant. I made a point of speaking to them, asking about their duties, checking their equipment. Not because I doubted their competence, but because sometimes the simple routine of inspection and conversation can steady a man's nerves. Young Phillips, barely 14 and 6 months out from Portsmouth, asked me if I thought we'd win. His voice cracked slightly on the question, and I saw him flush with embarrassment. I told him what my first lieutenant had told me all those years ago, that we'd do our duty, and that would be enough. It was a simple answer, perhaps too simple, but it had the virtue of being true. In battle, you don't fight for king and country, not really. You fight for the man standing next to you, and for the ship that's become your home. The morning wore on, and slowly the two fleets began to close with each other. From our position, in Lord Collingwood's lee column, I could see Nelson's weather column stretching away to our north. Victory in the lead, with her familiar three-decked profile cutting through the grey water. There was something almost ceremonial about it, the way the ships formed up, each taking her place in the line of battle like dancers taking their positions before the music begins. I spent some time checking the gun crews. We were a 74, carrying 28 32-pounders on our lower deck, 28 18-pounders on the upper deck, and 14 9-pounders on our quarter-deck and forecastle. Each gun had its crew of 6 to 8 men, and each crew had drilled together until they could load and fire with their eyes closed. The smell of gunpowder was already in the air from where the gunners' mates were preparing the charges, measuring out the powder with careful precision. The guns themselves were beautiful things in their way, cast-iron monsters that weighed 2.5 tons each, their surfaces worn smooth by countless hands. The 32-pounders could throw their shot nearly 2 miles, though at that distance they were more useful for frightening the enemy than actually hitting them. In close action, which we all knew was coming, they became instruments of terrible precision. I watched the men as they went through their preparations. There was Johnson, the gun captain of No. 3 gun on the lower deck, a weathered man from Liverpool, with hands like leather and a gap where his front teeth should have been. He'd been at the Nile with Nelson, and his steady presence helped calm the younger men. Next to him worked Davies, a pressed man from Wales who spoke little English, but had the strongest back on the ship. He could handle a 32-pound shot like other men handled cricket balls. The Marines were stationed in the tops, their red coats bright against the grey morning. They were good shots, most of them, and their job was to pick off enemy officers and clear the opposing decks when we closed to boarding range. I could see Sergeant Morrison up there, checking his men's muskets, making sure the flints were secure and the powder dry. Morrison had been at sea longer than some of the sailors, and he understood the particular challenges of fighting from a ship's rigging. As the morning progressed, the wind began to shift and strengthen. It was still light, barely enough to give us steerage way, but it was building from the southwest. The sea began to show little white caps, and I could feel Belleisle respond more eagerly to her helm. A ship needs wind the way a bird needs air, and we'd been wallowing for too long in the calm. The enemy line was becoming clearer now. 33 ships of the line, French and Spanish, stretched across our path like a barrier of wood and iron. Some I could identify by their distinctive rigs or the cut of their hulls. The massive Santissima Trinidad, the largest ship in the world, with her 4 gun decks and 130 guns. The French Neptune, sleek and fast, her sides painted in the distinctive French style. Ships I'd heard about in dispatches and rumours, now spread before us like entries in a catalogue of naval power. But there was something wrong with their formation, something that made my pulse quicken with possibility. They weren't in a proper line of battle. Instead, they formed a rough crescent, with gaps and irregularities that spoke of confused orders and poor seamanship. It was exactly the sort of formation that Nelson's tactics were designed to exploit. I found myself thinking about home, the way you do when something significant is about to happen. Not the grand things, but the small ones. The smell of my mother's kitchen on baking day, all flour and cinnamon and warmth. The sound of rain on the windows of our house in Portsmouth, where my father had served as a clerk in the dockyard. The feel of solid ground under my feet, something I'd learned not to take for granted after all these years at sea. My cabin was small, barely 6 feet by 8, but it was mine. I had my books there, a small collection of poetry and philosophy that I'd accumulated over the years. Mostly English poets, though I had a volume of Horace in Latin that helped me remember my schoolboy learning. There was a miniature portrait of my sister Mary, painted the year before I went to sea, showing her at 16 with the serious expression she wore when she was trying to look grown up. She'd be married now, with children of her own, living a life I could barely imagine, from my perspective, of endless horizons and salt spray. The ship's routine continued around me, the familiar rhythm of naval life that had become as natural as breathing, the bells marking the hours, the calls of the boatswain's mates, the steady tramp of feet on deck as the watch changed. But underneath it all was the growing tension, the knowledge that in a few hours everything would change. Some of us would be dead, some wounded, some would emerge unscathed to tell the story to their grandchildren. There was no way to know which category you'd fall into, and perhaps that was a mercy. I checked my pistol, a fine piece I'd bought from a gunsmith in Gibraltar. The lock was clean and well oiled, the flint sharp and secure. I had 2 spare flints in my pocket, wrapped in oiled cloth to keep them dry. My sword was my father's, a simple but well-made blade that had served him through his own career at sea. The grip was worn smooth by his hand, and now mine, and the blade held a good edge despite its age. These were the tools of my trade, as familiar and necessary as a carpenter's hammer or a farmer's plough. The French and Spanish ships were close enough now that I could make out individual details. The figurehead on a French 74, carved and painted in the elaborate style they favoured. The flutter of signal flags as their admiral tried to communicate with his scattered command. The dark mouths of gun ports opened for action, each one promising 36 pounds of iron shot when the time came. Our own guns were loaded and run out now, their black muzzles protruding through the ports like blunt fingers pointing at the enemy. The smell of slow match drifted across the deck, that distinctive sulphurous scent that every naval officer learns to associate with impending action. The gun crews stood by their pieces, stripped to the waist despite the cool air, their bodies gleaming with sweat and determination. I walked the length of the gun deck, speaking to the men, checking that everything was ready. The lower deck was dim, lit only by the light filtering through the gun ports, and a few battle lanterns hung from the beams. The 32-pounders crouched in the shadows, like sleeping beasts, their crews clustered around them in attitudes of tense readiness. The deck had been sanded to give better footing when it became slippery with blood, and the carpenter's crew stood ready with their tools to repair battle damage as it occurred. The surgeon had prepared his cockpit below, that grim space where the wounded would be brought when the fighting began. I'd visited him earlier to ensure he had everything he needed. Dr. Fairfax was a good man, steady and competent, with the kind of practical compassion that came from years of treating sailors' ailments and injuries. His instruments were laid out on a table covered with canvas, and his assistants had prepared tourniquets and bandages, laudanum for pain, and buckets of sand to absorb the blood that would inevitably flow. The thought of the cockpit always sobered me. I'd been down there after actions, checking on wounded men, and the sounds and smells were things that stayed with you. The cries of the injured, the sharp smell of blood mixing with the ever-present odours of tar and bilge water, the steady rasp of the surgeon's saw as he worked to save lives by taking limbs. It was the price of our profession, the cost of maintaining Britain's dominion over the seas. But there were compensations too, moments that made it all worthwhile. The sight of a well-handled ship responding to her helm like a living thing. The satisfaction of a gun crew working in perfect synchronization, loading and firing with mechanical precision. The fellowship of men who had shared danger and hardship, who trusted each other with their lives because they had no choice but to trust or die. I thought about the letters I'd written the night before, the ones that would be sent home if I didn't survive the day. One to my mother, trying to express feelings that seemed too large for words. One to my sister, asking her to remember me to her children, nieces and nephews I'd never met. One to Captain Harrison, who'd been my first commander and had taught me the fundamentals of seamanship and leadership. The letters were sealed and stored in my sea chest, along with my will and the few personal effects that might have meaning for someone other than myself. The enemy line was very close now, close enough that I could see individual men moving on their decks. They looked much like us, I realised. Sailors doing their duty, preparing for battle with the same mixture of professionalism and apprehension that we felt ourselves. The only difference was the flags they sailed under and the cause they served. In a few minutes, we'd be doing our best to kill each other, but at this moment we were simply men at sea, united by the common challenges of wind and wave and wooden ships. The signal came down from Victory. England expects that every man will do his duty. I saw it repeated by the ships ahead of us, and I felt a curious mixture of pride and sadness. Pride in serving under such a commander, sadness at the necessity that brought us to this point. War was never glorious, whatever the poets might say. It was simply something that sometimes had to be done, like cutting off a gangrenous limb to save the patient. The wind was strengthening now, and I could feel Belleisle lean into it as we approached the enemy line. The sea had turned from grey to green, and there were white caps showing everywhere. Good sailing weather, if we'd been bound for anywhere other than battle. The ship felt alive beneath my feet, responding to every shift of wind and current, every adjustment of sail and helm. I found myself thinking about time, the way it seemed to stretch and compress around moments of significance. The morning had felt endless, each minute crawling by with agonizing slowness. But now, with action imminent, everything seemed to accelerate. The enemy ships were growing larger by the minute, their details becoming clearer, their guns more menacing. Soon there would be no more time for thought or reflection, only the immediate demands of survival and duty. The last of the breakfast dishes had been cleared away and secured. The galley fire had been extinguished and sand scattered over the deck to prevent sparks. Every loose object had been lashed down or stowed below. The ship was as ready as human skill and experience could make her, stripped for action, like a prize fighter entering the ring. I checked my watch, a reliable piece I'd inherited from my father. Nearly noon, though the grey sky made it difficult to judge the time by the sun. Time enough for one last walk around the ship, one final check of our preparations. The men were ready, I could see it in their faces. The nervousness of the early morning had been replaced by a kind of grim determination, the look of professionals preparing to practice their deadly craft. The enemy was close enough now that I could hear the sound of their guns being run out, a rumbling thunder that carried across the water. Their ships were magnificent, I had to admit, products of centuries of naval tradition, manned by sailors who knew their business, even if their officers and governments had made questionable decisions about how to employ them. In a few minutes, the carefully ordered world of the morning would dissolve into chaos and smoke and thunder. Men would die, ships would be shattered, and the outcome would depend on training, courage, and the uncertain favour of fortune. But for now, in these last quiet moments before the storm, there was time for one final look around at the ship that had been my home and the men who had become my family. Sleep to History, a British naval officer at Trafalgar, Part 2. The first shot came from a French 74, a ranging shot that fell short and sent up a tall column of white water off our starboard bow. I felt rather than heard it, the way you feel thunder in your chest before the sound reaches your ears. That single shot seemed to break whatever spell had held the morning in its grey quiet, and suddenly the world was full of noise and smoke, and the particular chaos that comes when 33 ships of the line decide to try to sink each other. But it wasn't the sudden chaos you might expect. Naval battle, I'd learned from experience, has its own rhythm, its own terrible patience. Ships move slowly, you see, even with a good wind behind them. Changes happen gradually, like watching our hands move on a clock face. You have time to think, time to observe, time to feel afraid, and then push the fear away, because there's work to be done. Our target was clear now. Captain Hargood had chosen to break through the enemy line just astern of a massive Spanish first-rate, the Santa Ana. She was a beautiful ship, I had to admit, even as I prepared to help destroy her. Her sides were painted in the Spanish fashion, bright yellow with red trim, and her figurehead was carved with elaborate care. 112 guns, most of them heavier than anything we carried, and probably 800 men aboard her. The mathematics of naval warfare are simple and brutal. Weight of metal, as we called it, the side that can throw the most iron in the shortest time, usually wins, assuming reasonable equality in seamanship and courage. Santa Ana outgunned us significantly, but she was part of a line we intended to break, which meant she could only bring her guns on one side to bear, while we might be able to rake her from stern to stem with our full broadside. The wind was freshening nicely now, and I could feel Belleisle respond with something approaching eagerness. A ship of the line under full sail in a good wind is a magnificent sight, all grace and power and purposeful motion. Our sails were drawing well, curved out in perfect arcs that spoke of wind pressure and forward motion. The rigging sang with tension, that high note that told you everything was drawing as it should. I walked among the gun crews one more time, not because I doubted their readiness, but because it seemed important to be seen, to offer a word here and there, to demonstrate the kind of calm confidence that helps steady men's nerves when they're about to face shot and shell. The lower deck was dim and close, lit only by the battle lanterns and the grey light filtering through the gun ports. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and tar, sweat and fear, the particular mixture that announces impending action. The 32-pounders were loaded with round shot, solid iron balls that could punch through 2 feet of oak at close range. Later, if we got close enough, we'd switch to grape shot or canister, turning our cannons into massive shotguns that could clear an enemy deck in moments. But for now, it was round shot designed to hold the enemy's hull below the waterline, or if we were lucky, to rake her from end to end with devastating effect. Young Midshipman Phillips found me as I was checking the readiness of number 5 gun. His face was pale but determined, and I was pleased to see that his hands were steady as he saluted. I asked him about the signal flags, more to give him something to focus on than because I needed the information. He rattled off the current signals with the precise memory that came from months of drill, and I nodded approval before sending him aft to assist the signal midshipman. The enemy line was close now, perhaps 400 yards away, close enough to see the details of individual ships, the faces of men at their guns, the officers pacing their quarterdecks. The Spanish captain of Santa Ana was visible through my glass, a tall man in a blue uniform coat, heavy with gold lace. He stood near his wheel, speaking to his sailing master, occasionally raising his own telescope to study our approach. There's something almost intimate about naval combat at close range. You can see your enemies as individuals, not just anonymous figures serving distant guns. That Spanish captain had probably risen through the ranks much as I had, learning his trade in small ships and working his way up to command. He had a family somewhere perhaps, people who worried about him and prayed for his safe return. In a few minutes, I'd be doing my best to kill him, and he'd be trying to kill me, but at this moment he was simply another professional sailor doing his duty as he understood it. The first broadside from Santa Ana came when we were about 300 yards away. I saw the flash of flame along her side, brilliant orange tongues licking out from her gun ports, before the smoke billowed up and obscured her hull. The sound followed a heartbeat later, not the sharp crack you might expect, but a rolling thunder that seemed to go on forever. Iron shot whistled overhead, some of it striking our rigging with sounds like giant hammers hitting anvils. Our mizzen topsail yard took a hit and came down in a tangle of canvas and rope, but the damage control parties were on it immediately. I watched them work, experienced seamen who knew that their lives depended on keeping the ship functional. Within minutes, they had the wreckage cleared away and were rigging a replacement from the spare spars we carried lashed to the deck. The smoke from that first broadside drifted across the water between us, thick and white and acrid. Gunpowder smoke has a particular smell, sharp and sulphurous, that gets into your clothes and hair and stays there for days after an action. Mixed with it was the smell of burning wood from where some of the enemy's shot had struck home, and underneath it, all the ever-present salt tang of the sea. We were closing fast now, perhaps 200 yards, and narrowing quickly. I could see the Spanish gun crews reloading, working with the smooth efficiency that spoke of long practice. A well-trained crew could load and fire a 32-pounder in under 2 minutes, and these men were clearly among the best. But we had advantages too. British naval gunnery was renowned for its speed and accuracy, the product of endless drill and the philosophy that rapid-aimed fire was more effective than the slower, more deliberate approach favoured by our enemies. Captain Hargood gave the order to open fire when we were perhaps 150 yards from the enemy line. Our guns had been loaded and primed for nearly an hour, and the gun captains had been sighting along their pieces, waiting for the command. When it came, the response was immediate and devastating. The broadside from our lower deck guns was like being inside a thunderclap. The deck jumped under my feet as 28 32-pounders fired almost simultaneously, and for a moment I was deaf and blind, stunned by the concussion and choked by the sudden cloud of smoke that enveloped our ship. But training takes over in moments like these, and within seconds I was moving along the gun deck, checking for damage, encouraging the crews as they began the loading process again. The effect on Santa Ana was immediately visible. Several of our shots had struck home, punching dark holes in her yellow sides. I could see debris flying from her deck, pieces of wood and metal thrown up by the impact of iron on oak. But she was still firing back, her guns flashing through the smoke like angry eyes, and more shot whistled around us with that peculiar whining sound that iron makes when it's travelling fast enough to kill you. Our starboard bulwark took a hit that sent splinters flying like deadly arrows. I saw one of the Marines in the tops clutch his shoulder and stagger, blood showing bright red against his white crossbelts. But he stayed at his post, bringing his musket up to sight on the enemy's rigging, and I felt that familiar surge of pride in serving with such men. The battle was spreading now, as other ships came into action. I could hear the thunder of guns from other parts of the line, see the smoke rising from a dozen different combats. Victory was heavily engaged with several French ships, her familiar profile almost lost in the white clouds of gun smoke. The sound was constant now, not individual broadsides, but a continuous roar, like a waterfall made of thunder. We were very close to Santa Ana now, perhaps 50 yards separating our hulls. At this range, every shot told. I could see our round shot punching through her sides, sending up clouds of splinters and debris. But she was giving as good as she got. Our foretopsail was shot through in a dozen places, and there were gaps in our crew where men had been struck down by flying splinters or falling rigging. The heat was becoming intense, not from the sun, which was still hidden behind the grey overcast, but from the guns themselves. Each time a 32-pounder fired, it recoiled violently, its iron barrel growing hotter with each discharge. The gun crews were stripped to the waist now, their bodies gleaming with sweat despite the cool October air. Between each shot, they swabbed out the barrel with wet rags to prevent premature ignition of the next charge, and steam rose from the hot metal like breath on a winter morning. I found myself thinking about the mechanics of it all, the way the human mind sometimes focuses on technical details when faced with overwhelming chaos. Each gun required its crew to perform a dozen separate actions in precise sequence. Swab out the barrel, ram home the powder charge, add the shot, prime the touch hole, run the gun out through the port, aim and fire. Then begin the sequence again, over and over, until either the enemy surrendered or your own ship was too damaged to continue fighting. The noise was extraordinary. Not just the guns, though they dominated everything else, but the smaller sounds that told the story of battle. The crack of muskets from the Marines in the tops, the splintering crash of shot striking wood, the shouts of officers and petty officers trying to make themselves heard above the din, the screams of wounded men, a sound that cuts through everything else and lodges itself in your memory forever. But there were other sounds too, ones that spoke of competence and courage rather than destruction. The steady chanting of men working at the pumps, clearing the water that entered through shot holes below the waterline. The calls of the boatswain's mates directing damage control parties. The measured orders of gun captains controlling their crew's fire. These were the sounds of professionals doing their job under the most difficult circumstances imaginable. The smoke was so thick now that sometimes I could barely see from one end of the gun deck to the other. It wasn't just our smoke, but the combined discharge of dozens of ships firing hundreds of guns, all of it drifting on the wind and creating a fog of war that made it difficult to see what was happening beyond our immediate surroundings. The battle lanterns glowed like dim stars in this artificial twilight, and men moved like shadows through the murk. Santa Anna was firing less frequently now, which might mean that some of our shots had found their mark among her gun crews. Or it might mean that she was being more deliberate about her aim, taking time to sight properly before each discharge. It's impossible to tell in the middle of an action exactly how much damage you're doing to the enemy. You fire as fast and as accurately as you can, and hope that your gunnery is more effective than theirs. We took a hit below the waterline about this time, somewhere forward on the starboard side. I felt the ship shudder as the shot struck home, and within minutes I could hear the carpenters working to plug the hole. A ship of the line can absorb tremendous punishment and still remain afloat, but every hit weakens her structure, and enough holes below the waterline will eventually send even the strongest vessel to the bottom. The surgeon's party was busy now. I could see them moving wounded men below to the cockpit, their faces grim with the knowledge of what waited there. Naval surgery in the heat of battle is not a refined art. There's no time for careful diagnosis or gentle treatment. Shattered limbs are amputated, wounds are bandaged as quickly as possible, and men are given laudanum for the pain and sent back to fight if they're able. The lucky ones are wounded badly enough to be sent below, but not so badly that they die from their injuries. I checked my watch again, though time seemed to have lost much of its meaning. The action had been going on for perhaps 30 minutes, though it felt like hours. My uniform was soaked with sweat despite the cool air, and my throat was raw from breathing gun smoke. The white facings on my coat were grey with powder residue, and there were scorch marks on my sleeves from where I'd passed too close to the guns. The Spanish ship was showing signs of serious damage now. Her mizzen mast had been shot away completely, taking most of her stern canvas with it. Several of her gun ports had been enlarged by shot, creating ragged gaps in her sides. But she was still fighting, her remaining guns still flashing through the smoke, still sending iron death across the narrow gap that separated us. Our own damage was accumulating too. The main topmast had been badly wounded by a shot that had passed just under the cap, and it was only a matter of time before it came down entirely. Several of our guns on the upper deck had been dismounted by direct hits, their crews scattered or killed. The deck was slippery now, with blood and water, making footing treacherous for men trying to work the guns. But the crew's morale remained high. I could see it in the way they went about their work, efficiently and without panic, even as shot and splinters flew around them. British seamen had a reputation for steadiness under fire, and the men of Belleisle were proving worthy of that reputation. They'd trained for this moment through months of drill and exercise, and now that the test had come, they were meeting it with the kind of professional competence that was the pride of the Royal Navy. The wind was shifting slightly, backing toward the south, and I could feel the ship respond to the change. It brought our stern a bit closer to Santa Anna, which meant we could bring more of our guns to bear on her, but it also exposed us to raking fire from other enemy ships, and I could see shots coming in from multiple angles now as the Spanish captain tried to support his flagship. A 36-pound shot from somewhere aft took out 3 men from number 7 gun crew, killing 2 outright and wounding the third so badly that he was carried below immediately. The gun captain, a steady man named Morrison, who'd been at sea for 20 years, simply called for replacements and had his piece ready to fire again within 5 minutes. It was that kind of matter-of-fact courage that won battles, not the dramatic gestures that found their way into the newspapers afterward. I was checking the magazine access when the next crisis developed. A shot from Santa Ana struck our mainmast just above the deck, sending a shower of splinters across the quarterdeck and wounding several of the signal party. The mast didn't fall immediately, but I could see that it was badly damaged, held up more by the rigging than by its own structural integrity. If it came down, it would take most of our main canvas with it and leave us nearly helpless. The carpenter's crew was on it immediately, working to shore up the damaged timber with spare planks and iron bolts. It was dangerous work, exposed to enemy fire, and complicated by the ship's motion, but they went about it with the same methodical competence they'd shown in peacetime repairs. The sea teaches you that ships are fragile things, constantly in need of maintenance and repair, and a good crew knows that their lives depend on keeping their vessel functional. The action was general now along both columns. Through brief gaps in the smoke, I could see ships locked in individual combats all along the line. Some were so close together that their yards were entangled, men fighting with cutlasses and pistols across the narrow gaps between their hulls. Others maintained a more formal distance, exchanging broadsides with mechanical regularity. The sea between the fleets was littered with debris, pieces of masts and spars, torn canvas, and things I preferred not to identify too closely. Santa Ana's fire was definitely slackening now. Several of her gun ports were dark, which meant that either the guns had been disabled or their crews were too reduced to serve them effectively. But she was still dangerous, still capable of inflicting serious damage with her remaining armament. And she was still flying her colours, which meant that her captain had no intention of surrendering while he retained the ability to fight. Our own casualties were mounting steadily, not catastrophically, not at a rate that threatened our ability to fight the ship, but with the steady attrition that was the reality of naval combat. Men wounded by splinters, burned by muzzle flashes, struck down by falling rigging or flying debris. Each loss weakened us slightly, made our responses a little slower, our fire a little less effective. But we were gaining the upper hand, I thought. Santa Ana was visibly settling by the stern, which suggested that she was taking water faster than her pumps could handle it. Her fire was irregular now, single guns firing when they were ready, rather than the coordinated broadsides of earlier in the action. Most telling of all, I could see men on her deck who weren't at their guns, sailors who should have been serving the great cannons, but were instead working frantically at damage control. The thought occurred to me that this was probably the largest naval battle in history. Certainly, it was the largest I'd ever been part of, with nearly 60 ships of the line engaged in close combat. The sound alone was unprecedented, a continuous thunder that seemed to shake the very air. The smoke was so thick that it was creating its own weather, blocking the sun and turning the afternoon into an artificial twilight. I found myself thinking about the men who weren't there, the thousands of sailors and marines who'd trained for this moment, but were serving in other ships, on other stations, in other parts of the world. The Royal Navy was a vast organisation, spread across every ocean, and this battle represented only a fraction of British naval power. But it was perhaps the most important fraction, the concentrated essence of everything we'd learned about fighting at sea. The Spanish ship's mainmast came down about this time, falling toward us with a crash that I felt through the deck of our own ship. It brought down a tangle of rigging and canvas that draped across the water between us like a bridge. For a moment I thought some of her crew might try to board us across this accidental gangway, but her officers were too busy trying to keep their ship afloat to organise such an attack. Our own mainmast was still standing, though I could see that the carpenter's repairs were only temporary. In a heavy sea, or under the strain of carrying full sail, it would probably come down. But for now, it was holding, keeping our main canvas drawing and giving us the manoeuvrability we needed to stay in action. The battle had been going on for over an hour now, and I was beginning to feel the effects of sustained action. My ears were ringing from the constant gunfire, and my throat was raw from breathing smoke. My hands were black with powder residue, and there were burn marks on my sleeves from passing too close to the hot gun barrels. But there was also an odd exhilaration, the strange energy that comes from intense focus and shared danger. Santa Anna's colours were still flying, but she was clearly a beaten ship. Her stern was almost awash, and she was listing heavily to starboard. Most of her guns were silent now, and I could see boats being lowered from her davits as her crew prepared to abandon ship, but she wasn't surrendering yet, and as long as her flag flew, we had to treat her as an active enemy. The smoke was beginning to clear slightly as the wind strengthened, and I could get a better sense of how the battle was developing. Victory was heavily engaged with several French ships, her hulls scarred and battered, but still fighting. Other British ships were locked in individual combats, up and down the line, some clearly winning, others in desperate struggles for survival. But the enemy line was broken. That much was clear, even through the smoke and confusion. Nelson's tactics had worked. Instead of the formal line of battle engagement that naval tradition called for, we'd broken through their formation in two places, and were now fighting a series of individual actions that favoured our superior gunnery and seamanship. I was checking on the wounded when word came from the quarterdeck that Santa Anna was striking her colours. Looking up, I could see that her ensign was indeed coming down, hauled down by hands that shook either with exhaustion or emotion. A cheer went up from our crew, the first sound of celebration I'd heard since the action began. But it was a subdued cheer, the acknowledgement of professionals who knew they'd done their job well, rather than the wild enthusiasm of landsmen. The Spanish ship was sinking, that much was clear. Her stern was completely awash now, and she was settling rapidly by the head. Boats were pulling away from her sides, crowded with survivors who'd given up trying to save their ship. It was a magnificent sight in its way, the death of a great ship of the line, but also a sobering one. That could just as easily have been us, our ship settling beneath the waves, our crew struggling to survive in the cold Atlantic water. But there was no time to reflect on might-have-beens. Other enemy ships were closing on us, drawn by the sight of Santa Anna's defeat, or simply continuing to fight their way through the confused melee that the battle had become. I could see a French 74 approaching from the northeast, her guns run out and ready for action. She was flying a Commodore's broad pennant, which meant that her captain was a senior officer who wouldn't be easily discouraged. We secured from action stations temporarily, using the brief respite to tend our wounded, repair our most critical damage, and prepare for the next phase of the battle. The gun crews remained at their posts, but they took the opportunity to drink water, wipe the sweat from their faces, and check their equipment. Several of our 32-pounders had been fired so many times that their barrels were almost too hot to touch, and we swabbed them down with wet rags to cool them before the next action. The deck was a shambles, blood and splinters everywhere, pieces of rigging and canvas scattered about like the debris from a hurricane. But the crew was already working to clear it up, knowing that a clean deck was a safe deck when it came to working the guns. The wounded had been carried below to the surgeon, and the dead had been covered with canvas pending their burial at sea. I took a moment to write a quick note in my journal, trying to capture some sense of what we'd just experienced, but words seemed inadequate to describe the reality of naval combat, the noise, the smoke, the constant threat of sudden death, the way time seemed to stretch and compress simultaneously. It was something that had to be lived through to be understood, and even then understanding came slowly, in fragments and impressions rather than clear narrative. The French ship was closing rapidly now, and I could see that she meant business. Her captain was bringing her straight at us, obviously intending to engage at close range where his heavier armament would have maximum effect. It was a bold move, the kind of aggressive tactics that had made the French Navy dangerous even when it was outnumbered. Captain Hargood ordered the ship cleared for action, once again, and the crew responded with the same efficiency they'd shown all day. Within minutes we were ready to receive the enemy, our guns loaded and run out, our people at their stations. The brief rest had been enough to restore morale and energy, and I could see in the men's faces that they were ready for whatever came next. The afternoon sun was trying to break through the overcast now, sending occasional shafts of golden light through the smoke and confusion of battle. When it struck the water, it turned the sea a brilliant blue-green that seemed almost tropical despite our northern latitude. It was beautiful, in a way that seemed incongruous with the destruction and death that surrounded us. But beauty has its place in battle too, I think. The graceful lines of ships under sail, the precise choreography of gun crews at work, the way courage and competence can transform even the most desperate situation into something approaching art. It was one of the paradoxes of naval warfare that something so destructive could also be so magnificent to observe. Sleep to History, a British naval officer at Trafalgar, Part 3. The French ship came at us with all the grace and menace of a hunting cat, her black hull cutting through the water with purposeful elegance. She was the Fougueux, I learned later, a 74 like ourselves, but newer, built in the dockyards of Toulon with all the refinements that French naval architects had developed over decades of war. Her captain was clearly a man of experience, bringing her down on us at an angle that would let him rake our stern with his full broadside while presenting only his bow to our guns. But Captain Hargood had seen that manoeuvre before, and he ordered the helm hard to starboard just as Fougueux reached firing range. It was beautifully done, turning us just enough to present our own broadside instead of our vulnerable stern, and the French captain's careful approach suddenly became a mutual engagement at pistol shot range. I could see his face through my glass as he realised what had happened, a momentary expression of surprise and perhaps grudging respect before he turned back to directing his own ship's fire. The exchange that followed was the most intense of the day. Both ships were relatively fresh, their crews still at full strength and their guns in good condition. When Fougueux fired her first broadside, the effect was devastating. Shot crashed through our bulwarks, dismounted 2 of our 18-pounders, and sent a shower of splinters across the quarterdeck that wounded half the signal party. But our response was immediate and equally destructive, our lower deck guns punching hole after hole in her side at a range where every shot told. The sound was different at this range, sharper and more immediate than the rolling thunder of our earlier engagement. I could hear individual guns firing, the crash of shot striking timber, the screams of wounded men from both ships mixing in a chorus of agony that carried clearly across the narrow strip of water between us. The smoke was so thick that sometimes I lost sight of the enemy completely, our world reduced to the immediate circle of deck around each gun. I was moving along the gun deck, checking on the crews and encouraging the men, when a 36-pound shot from Fougueux struck our number 4 gun just as it was being loaded. The result was catastrophic. The gun was dismounted completely, its carriage shattered into splinters, and 3 of the crew were killed instantly. A 4th man, the gun captain, had his right arm torn off at the shoulder, but somehow remained conscious, trying to direct the survivors in clearing the wreckage until we could get him below to the surgeon. The lower deck was becoming a charnel house. Blood pooled in the scuppers despite the sand that had been scattered to provide footing, and the air was thick with more than just gunpowder smoke. There was the smell of blood and fear, burned flesh from men caught too close to muzzle flashes, and the particular stench that comes when shot penetrates the hull below the waterline, and bilge water begins to mix with everything else. But the men kept working. That was what struck me most forcibly, the way they continued to serve their guns even as their shipmates fell around them. When a crew was reduced by casualties, men from other stations filled in without being ordered. When a gun was dismounted, they cleared the wreckage and got the next piece ready to fire. It was the kind of disciplined courage that comes from training and tradition. The knowledge that their lives depended on keeping up the rate of fire no matter what else was happening. The battle had been going on for nearly 2 hours now, and I was beginning to feel the accumulated strain of sustained action. My uniform was torn in several places where splinters had caught the fabric, and there were powder burns on my hands from helping to serve one of the guns when its crew was reduced. My throat was raw from breathing smoke and shouting orders, and there was a persistent ringing in my ears that made it difficult to hear normal conversation. Fougueux was giving as good as she got, perhaps better. Her gunnery was excellent, the product of crews that had clearly trained together for months or years. I could see the precise timing of their broadsides, the way each gun fired in sequence to create a rolling thunder that maximised the effect on our ship's structure. Several of our gun ports had been enlarged by shot, creating ragged gaps in our sides that let in spray and made it even more difficult to serve the remaining pieces. Our mizzen mast came down about this time, cut through by a chain shot that had been aimed at our rigging. It fell across the quarterdeck in a tangle of canvas and rope, pinning several men beneath its weight and making it almost impossible to work the wheel. The bosun's mates were on it immediately, working with axes and knives to clear the wreckage, but it was slow work under fire, and we lost steerage way for several critical minutes. During that brief period when we couldn't manoeuvre, Fougueux managed to cross our stern and deliver a raking broadside the length of our ship. It was exactly the manoeuvre her captain had been trying to achieve from the beginning, and the effect was terrible. Shot crashed through our stern windows and travelled the entire length of the gun deck, dismounting guns, killing and wounding men, and creating havoc among crews that had been working with smooth efficiency just moments before. I was checking on the magazine access when that broadside struck, and I felt the ship shudder from stem to stern as 36 guns fired almost simultaneously into our vulnerable rear end. The sound was different from a normal broadside, more of a continuous crash than individual explosions, and when it was over, the silence seemed unnatural, broken only by the groans of wounded men and the sound of water rushing through holes in our hull. But we weren't finished yet. The crew of the afterguns had suffered badly from the raking fire, but the forward batteries were still intact and ready for action. As soon as we got steerage way back, Captain Hargood brought us around to present our port broadside to Fougueux, and we gave her a taste of what she'd just served to us. At a range of perhaps 30 yards, every shot told, and I could see our round shot punching through her sides and creating havoc on her gun deck. The French ship's mizzen mast went by the board just as ours had, victim of a shot that cut through its base and sent it crashing across their quarterdeck. But unlike us, they seemed to have difficulty clearing the wreckage, and I could see their sterns sagging as the fallen mast dragged in the water and acted like a sea anchor. It was the kind of small advantage that could make the difference in a close action, and Captain Hargood was quick to exploit it. We managed to cross Fougueux's bow and deliver our own raking fire, 28 32-pounders firing in sequence down the length of her gun deck. The effect was immediately visible. Several of her gun ports went dark as the pieces were dismounted, or their crews scattered, and debris flew from her deck as our shot found targets among her crew and equipment. But she was still fighting, still dangerous, and her remaining guns continued to fire with the precision that marked a well-trained crew. The afternoon was wearing on, and the light was beginning to change as the sun worked its way toward the western horizon. The smoke from dozens of ships had created its own weather system, a layer of white and grey that hung over the battlefield like fog. Occasionally the wind would shift and clear patches of it away, giving brief glimpses of other actions taking place around us. But mostly Our world had contracted to the immediate area around our own ship and our current opponent. I took a moment to check my watch and was surprised to discover that it was after 4 o'clock. The battle had been going on for nearly 4 hours, though time had become elastic in the way it does during intense action. Some moments seemed to last forever, particularly when shot was flying and you were waiting for the next broadside. Others passed in a blur of activity that left you wondering where the time had gone. The surgeon sent word that the cockpit was full and that he was running low on laudanum for the wounded. It was the kind of message that brings the reality of war into sharp focus. Behind all the technical discussion of gunnery and seamanship, the professional satisfaction of a well-fought action, there was the simple human cost of what we were doing. Good men were dying, others were being maimed for life, and the lucky ones would carry the scars and memories for the rest of their days. But there was no time for such reflections in the middle of an action. Fougueux was still fighting, still capable of inflicting serious damage, and our job was to reduce her to surrender or destruction before she could do the same to us. The mathematics of naval warfare were simple and brutal. The side that could maintain effective fire longest would win, assuming roughly equal courage and competence. Our own casualties were mounting steadily, not catastrophically, but with the steady attrition that was the reality of close action. Men wounded by splinters, burned by muzzle flashes, struck down by falling debris or flying shots. Each loss made us slightly less effective, slightly slower to respond, slightly more vulnerable to the enemy's fire, but the crew's morale remained high, sustained by the knowledge that they were giving better than they got, and by the kind of stubborn pride that was the hallmark of British seamen. The French ship's fire was definitely slackening now. Several of her gun ports were dark, which meant that either the guns had been disabled or their crews were too reduced to serve them effectively. Her rate of fire had dropped from the coordinated broadsides of earlier in the action to irregular, single shots as guns came ready. Most telling of all, I could see smoke rising from her deck that wasn't from gunpowder, suggesting that some of our shot had started fires among her stores or equipment. But she was still dangerous. A 74 gunship, even badly damaged, could inflict terrible casualties with a single, well-aimed broadside. And French crews had a reputation for fighting desperately when cornered, the kind of last-ditch courage that could turn a defeat into a mutual destruction. We had to maintain our vigilance and our rate of fire until either she struck her colours or we'd reduced her to a helpless hulk. Our own ship was showing the effects of prolonged action. The deck was littered with debris from our own damaged rigging, mixed with splinters from enemy shot. Several of our guns had been dismounted, their crews redistributed to the remaining pieces. The bulwarks were shot through in dozens of places, creating a ragged, gap-toothed appearance that spoke of hard fighting. But the essential structure was still sound, and we could still manoeuvre and fight effectively. I was helping to direct the fire of No. 6 gun when the crisis came. A shot from Fougueux struck our foremast just above the deck, not cutting it through completely, but damaging it so badly that it began to lean at an alarming angle. The forestays parted under the strain, and for a moment it looked as though the entire mast would come down across our deck, bringing most of our forward canvas with it and leaving us unable to manoeuvre. The boatswain was up there before I could even call for volunteers, working his way out along the damaged stays with the kind of casual courage that marked the best seamen. He managed to secure a temporary repair with spare rope and a block and tackle. Not a permanent solution, but enough to keep the mast standing until we could make proper repairs. It was exactly the kind of seamanship that won battles, the ability to solve critical problems under fire with whatever materials were at hand. The French ship's mainmast came down about this time, victim of repeated hits that had finally severed enough stays to bring the whole structure crashing down. It fell toward us, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it might actually reach across the gap between our ships and entangle our own rigging. But it fell short, crashing into the water with a tremendous splash that sent spray across both decks. The loss of her mainmast seemed to break something in Fougue's resistance. Her fire became even more irregular, and I could see men on her deck who weren't serving guns but were instead working desperately at the pumps or trying to clear wreckage. She was settling slightly by the stern, which suggested that she was taking water faster than her crew could handle, and several of her gun ports were awash, making it impossible to work the lower deck batteries. But her colours were still flying, and as long as that tricolour remained at her peak, we had to treat her as an active enemy. It's one of the ironies of naval warfare that a ship can be obviously beaten, her crew decimated, and her structure shattered, but she's still legally and tactically an enemy until her captain formally surrenders by striking his flag. The wind was shifting again, backing more toward the south, and I could feel our ship respond to the change. It brought us slightly closer to Fougue, close enough that I could see individual faces on her deck, could make out the expressions of men who'd been fighting for their lives for the better part of 4 hours. They looked much as we probably did, exhausted, powder-blackened, wounded in some cases, but still grimly determined to do their duty as they understood it. There's something almost intimate about naval combats at very close range. You're trying to kill men you can see clearly, men who are obviously professionals doing their job under impossible circumstances. That French gun captain working his remaining piece with only 2 men to help him, training it carefully on our hull before firing. The officer on their quarterdeck, probably wounded from the way he favoured his left arm, still trying to con his ship into an advantageous position. The marine in their tops, reloading his muskets with mechanical precision despite the chaos around him. Our own crew was showing the strain of prolonged action. They'd been at their guns for over 4 hours now, working in conditions of incredible noise, heat and danger. Their faces were black with powder smoke, their bodies gleaming with sweat despite the cool October air. Many showed minor wounds, cuts from splinters or burns from muzzle flashes, but they stayed at their posts and continued to serve their pieces with the kind of professional competence that was the pride of the Royal Navy. I found myself thinking about the larger battle, wondering how the other ships were faring. Through occasional gaps in the smoke, I could catch glimpses of other actions. British ships locked in individual combat with French or Spanish opponents. Some were clearly winning, their enemies dismasted or obviously sinking. Others seemed to be having a harder time of it, engaged in the kind of close, bitter fighting that we were experiencing ourselves. But the enemy battle line was clearly broken. That much was obvious even through the smoke and confusion. Instead of the formal line of battle that naval tradition called for, the action had dissolved into a series of individual combats scattered across several miles of ocean. It was exactly what Nelson had planned. The kind of confused melee that favoured British seamanship and gunnery over the more formal tactics that our enemies preferred. The sun was getting lower now, its light taking on that golden quality that comes in the late afternoon. When it managed to penetrate the smoke, it illuminated scenes of incredible destruction and incredible beauty. Ships locked in mortal combat, their sides lit by muzzle flashes, surrounded by the white foam of the sea and the grey-white clouds of gun smoke. It was like something from a painting, if any artist had ever been mad enough to try to capture the reality of naval warfare. Fougue's fire was becoming very irregular now, single guns firing when they were ready, rather than coordinated broadsides. Several of her ports were completely dark, and I could see that her crew was having difficulty serving even the guns that remained functional, but she was still fighting, still sending shot across the narrow gap between us, still capable of inflicting casualties among our own crew. Our response was becoming more methodical as well. With the immediate crisis of close action past, we could take more time to aim our guns, to make sure that each shot told. The gun captains were sighting carefully along their pieces, waiting for the roll of the ship to bring their targets into perfect alignment before touching off their charges. It was precision gunnery of the highest order. the kind of shooting that could only be achieved by crews that had trained together for months or years. I was checking on the magazine party when word came from the quarterdeck that other ships were closing on us. Looking up, I could see at least 2 more enemy vessels approaching, drawn by the sound of our action, or simply continuing their own fights as the battle swept across this part of the ocean. One was a Spanish 74, the other appeared to be a French frigate, smaller than either of the ships of the line, but fast and manoeuvrable. The prospect of facing multiple opponents simultaneously was daunting, but not unprecedented. British ships had been fighting against odds for most of the war, and our crews were trained to handle such situations. The key was to maintain our rate of fire against fougue while positioning ourselves to meet the new threats as they developed. It would require seamanship of the highest order, but Captain Hargood was equal to the challenge. The Spanish ship reached us first, opening fire at long range with her forward guns. The shot fell mostly short, sending up tall columns of white water that drenched our deck with spray, but it was a clear indication that we were about to face a much more complex tactical situation. Fighting one enemy was difficult enough. Fighting 3 simultaneously would test every aspect of our training and experience. But fougue chose that moment to strike her colours. I saw the tricolour come fluttering down from her peak, hauled down by hands that shook with exhaustion or emotion. A cheer went up from our crew, but it was a weary cheer, the acknowledgement of professionals who knew they'd done their job well, but were too tired for wild celebration. We'd been in continuous action for over 4 hours, and the strain was showing on every man aboard. The French ship was clearly sinking. Her stern was almost awash, and she was listing heavily to port, where most of our shot had struck home. Boats were being lowered from her davits, crowded with survivors who had given up trying to save their ship. It was a magnificent sight in its way. The end of a gallant fight, but also a sobering reminder of what could happen to any of us if fortune turned against us. But there was no time for reflection. The Spanish 74 was closing rapidly, and the French frigate was trying to work around to our stern, where she could rake us with her lighter guns. We were about to face a fresh action, with a crew that was already exhausted and a ship that had suffered significant damage. It would be the ultimate test of everything we'd learned about fighting at sea. Captain Hargood ordered the ship cleared for action, once again, though there was little clearing left to do. We'd been fighting for so long that everything unnecessary had already been secured or shot away. The gun crews took their positions with the weary efficiency of men who had been through this routine many times before, checking their pieces, making sure their equipment was ready, preparing for whatever came next. The Spanish ship opened fire at about 400 yards, her broadside perfectly timed and devastating in its effect. Shot crashed through our already damaged bulwarks, dismounted another of our guns, and sent splinters flying across the deck like deadly arrows. But our response was immediate and equally destructive. Our remaining guns speaking with the authority of crews that had been perfecting their craft for the past 4 hours. The frigate was the more dangerous opponent, I realised. She was faster and more manoeuvrable than either of the ships of the line, able to dart in and deliver raking fire before we could bring our main batteries to bear. Her captain was clearly experienced, using his ship's advantages to maximum effect while avoiding the kind of close action that would favour our heavier armament. But British frigate captains had perfected the same tactics, and we'd fought against them often enough to know the counters. The key was to present a constantly changing target, to manoeuvre our ship so that the frigate couldn't maintain a favourable position long enough to deliver effective fire. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, played out with 36-pound cannons instead of claws and teeth. The action that followed was different from our earlier engagements, more fluid and dynamic as 3 ships manoeuvred for advantage in the confined space of the battlefield. We were no longer locked in the static broadside-to-broadside combat that had characterised our fight with fougue, but instead engaged in a running battle that tested every aspect of seamanship and gunnery. The Spanish ship was well handled, I had to admit, Her captain brought her down on us at exactly the right angle, her broadside perfectly timed to catch us as we turned to avoid the frigate's attack. The result was devastating. Shot crashed through our stern, travelled the length of our gun deck, and created havoc among crews that were already reduced by earlier casualties. But we gave as good as we got. Our port broadside, fired as we came around, caught the Spanish ship just as she was beginning to reload. 24 32-pounders, all that remained functional on that side, fired almost simultaneously into her hull at a range where every shot told. I could see our round shot punching through her sides, creating dark holes that spoke of destroyed guns and scattered crews. The frigate took that moment to dart in from our starboard quarter, her lighter guns firing rapidly as she tried to rake our stern before we could bring our main batteries to bear. But one of our marines in the tops, a steady man named Collins who'd been picking off enemy officers all day, put a musket ball through her captain just as he was giving orders for the attack. The frigate sheered off immediately, her crew apparently losing heart with the loss of their leader. The Spanish 74 was made of sterner stuff. Despite the damage from our broadside, she continued to close with us, her remaining guns firing with the kind of precision that spoke of a well-trained crew. Her captain was visible on her quarterdeck, a tall man in a blue uniform coat who handled his ship with obvious skill and determination. But she was outnumbered now, facing not only our fire, but also that of another British ship that had worked her way clear of her own opponent and was approaching from the north. I recognised the newcomer as HMS Swiftsure, a 74 like ourselves, but in much better condition. Her captain brought her into action with textbook precision, positioning his ship to deliver a raking broadside just as the Spanish ship was fully engaged with us. The effect was immediately decisive. Caught between two fires taking punishment from two directions simultaneously, the Spanish ship's resistance crumbled rapidly. Her mizzen mast came down first, cut through by a shot from Swiftsure that severed the stays and sent the entire structure crashing across her quarterdeck. Her mainmast followed within minutes, victim of our own continued fire and the structural damage that accumulated from prolonged action. Within a quarter hour of Swiftshure's arrival, the Spanish ship was a dismasted hulk, her colours coming down in surrender. The frigate had disappeared during this action, using her superior speed to escape what had become an impossible situation. It was probably the wisest course for her captain, assuming command after the loss of his superior. Frigates weren't built to fight ships of the line, and discretion was often the better part of valour when facing overwhelming odds. The sun was setting now, its light turning the smoke-filled air a golden orange that was almost beautiful despite the destruction around us. The great battle was winding down, individual actions concluding as ships either surrendered or managed to escape in the growing darkness. The sea between the fleets was littered with debris, broken masts and torn canvas, pieces of ships and things I preferred not to examine too closely. We secured from action stations for what I hoped would be the final time that day. The crew was exhausted, their faces blackened with powder smoke, their bodies aching from hours of working the heavy guns. Many showed wounds, minor cuts and burns mostly, but they'd stayed at their posts and done their duty with the kind of professional competence that was the pride of the Royal Navy. The damage to our ship was extensive, but not fatal. The mizzen mast was gone completely. The foremast was badly damaged, and there were holes in our hull that would need immediate attention to keep us afloat. Several of our guns had been dismounted, and our bulwarks looked like broken teeth, where shot had torn away sections of the ship's side, but the essential structure was sound, and we were still afloat and able to manoeuvre under our remaining canvas. Our casualties had been heavy. 16 men killed outright, another 23 wounded badly enough to be sent below to the surgeon. In a crew of 600, that wasn't catastrophic, but each loss was felt personally by men who had lived and worked together for months or years. The sea service creates bonds between men that are stronger than family ties in some ways, forged by shared danger and mutual dependence. I walked through the ship as the crew began the work of clearing up after action, checking on the men, assessing damage, trying to get a sense of our overall condition. The lower deck was a shambles, blood and splinters everywhere, guns dismounted or damaged, the deck itself torn up in places where shot had penetrated the hull. But the crew was already working to restore order, swabbing down the guns, clearing away debris, beginning the long process of repair that would make us ready for sea again. The gun crews were particularly tired, as they had reason to be. They'd been serving their pieces for over 5 hours, working in conditions of incredible heat, noise, and danger. Their faces were black with powder smoke, their hands burned and cut from handling hot metal and rough rope. But there was satisfaction in their exhaustion, the knowledge that they'd done their job well and contributed to what was clearly a great victory. Word came down from the quarterdeck that the battle was essentially over. The combined French and Spanish fleet had been shattered, with more than 20 of their ships captured or destroyed. Nelson himself had been mortally wounded aboard Victory, but he'd lived long enough to know that his tactics had achieved complete success. It was the kind of decisive victory that happened perhaps once in a generation, the sort of triumph that would be studied in naval colleges for decades to come. But victory came at a price, as it always did. I thought about the men we'd lost, good sailors who'd served their country faithfully and died in the performance of their duty. They deserved to be remembered for more than just names on a casualty list, though that's probably all the recognition most of them would receive. The sea had claimed them, as it claimed so many, but they died as they'd lived, doing their job with competence and courage. The immediate task was to get our damaged ships to safety before the weather turned bad. The barometer had been falling all day, and there were signs that a storm was approaching from the west. A lee shore in a gale was no place for damaged ships, and several of the prizes we'd taken were in no condition to survive heavy weather. It would require seamanship of the highest order to get everyone safely into harbour. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, as the sun set over the scene of our victory, there was time for a moment's quiet reflection. We'd been part of something historic, one of those battles that changed the course of wars and the fate of nations. The French and Spanish fleets would not threaten British commerce again, and Napoleon's plans for invading England had died with their defeat. I found myself thinking about home again, as I often did in quiet moments. My mother would be worried, as mothers always worry about sons at sea. My sister would be wondering if her brother had survived whatever action the fleet had fought. They'd learn eventually, from the newspapers or official dispatches, but it would be weeks before letters could reach them with personal news. The stars were coming out now, brilliant points of light in the clear sky above the dissipating smoke. Navigation stars, the same ones that had guided sailors for centuries and would continue to do so long after all of us were forgotten. There was something comforting about their constancy, their indifference to human affairs. Wars might come and go, battles might be won or lost, but the stars remained, marking out the paths across the trackless ocean. The crew was settling into the routine of damage control and repair, the unglamorous but essential work that followed every action. Carpenters plugging shot holes, sailmakers patching torn canvas, gun crews cleaning and inspecting their pieces. It was the kind of steady, methodical work that kept ships functional and crews alive, less dramatic than battle, but equally important to survival at sea. I made my way to my cabin, a small space that seemed luxurious after the chaos of the gun deck. My books were still there, somehow undamaged despite the shot that had passed through the ship. I picked up my volume of Horace, the Latin poet, who'd written about war and peace from the perspective of someone who'd seen both. His words seemed particularly appropriate after a day like this, reminders that human nature didn't change much across the centuries. The ship was settling into her night routine, the watch systems that kept her safe in the darkness. Lookouts in the tops, men at the wheel, others checking the pumps and making sure that damage from the day's action wasn't getting worse. It was the kind of careful attention to detail that separated professional seamen from amateurs, the understanding that survival at sea required constant vigilance. I wrote a few lines in my journal before turning in, trying to capture something of what we'd experienced, but words seemed inadequate to describe the reality of naval combat, the way it combined terror and exhilaration, professional satisfaction and human tragedy. Future generations would read about the Battle of Trafalgar in their history books, but they'd never fully understand what it felt like to live through it. The hammock felt incredibly comfortable after the day's exertion, despite the fact that it was still the same canvas slung between the same hooks that I'd used for months. But exhaustion has a way of making any resting place seem luxurious, and I was asleep within minutes of lying down. My last conscious thought was gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for victory, for the privilege of serving with such men in such a cause. The morning would bring new challenges, the complex work of getting damaged ships to safety and dealing with hundreds of prisoners from the captured enemy vessels. But that was tomorrow's burden. Tonight, there was only the gentle motion of the ship, the familiar sounds of wind and water, and the deep sleep that comes after duty well performed.